I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.
Welcome to Studio Sacramento. I'm your host, Scott Syfax. The California Redistricting Panel has finished its work on the final maps for the state's congressional and legislative districts. These maps are going to reshape districts throughout California and impact millions of voters. Joining me today to bring clarity to this topic is Paul Mitchell, CEO of Redistricting Partners, Matt Rexroad, Yolo County Supervisor and the founding partner of Meridian Pacific, and Helen Hutchison, the Vice President of the League of Women Voters of California. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Helen, I want to start with you.
Okay.
The League was one of the catalysts behind this entire redistricting process. What's the League's view of the results thus far?
We are overwhelmingly happy with the results. We've just been amazed at how great the process has been. It's been open, it's been transparent, it's been participatory. The discourse has been, for the most part, very civil. The commissioners have been particularly exemplary about their civil discourse. And so, I can't say too many good things about the whole process.
Matt, as an elected official and also as a professional that follows this work, what is it that you've noticed about this process in terms of how it's rolled out so far?
Well, I guess I would point out that this process is certainly far better than we would have had without Prop 11 and Prop 20, which the League of Women Voters and others were very involved in. I think it's been a more open and transparent process than it would have been if the governor and the legislative leaders would have drawn these maps. I think that's clearly the case. I guess I disagree with Helen in terms of being disappointed with the openness and transparency of the commission as they've gone through this process. Was it better than it would have been? Yes, but was it as good as it could have been, or as it was advertised to be? I don't think so at all. I'm actually very critical of the process the commission did.
Why not?
Well, I'm not, because, for example, the commission raised the expectations very high when they announced what their schedule was going to be. They released a first set of maps, which they called their draft maps, and then they immediately abandoned them and went to another set of maps. We didn't see another true set of maps until the day before the commission voted on them to put them out. And there are some problems with those maps that they're not going to be able to correct now, which they would have been able to deal with had they released second and third draft maps that they said they were going to do early on in the process. And avoiding that review, the comments by the public, the ability to be able to correct some of what I think are errors in the maps, did a disservice to the process, and it was unnecessarily so. One real important point. The commission spent about 80% of their time on communities of interest, traveled around the state and got a lot of public comment. Communities of interest are very important, and they're kind of what drove the redistricting process to go to a commission. However, they spent about 5% of their time on the Voting Rights Act, and it probably should have been the other way around. I think if you would have had 14 commissioners here and asked them what their standard was for the Voting Rights Act, you'd get 14 different answers, and that was not a good part of the process at all.
Paul, your reaction?
Well, I agree with Matt and Helen both. The process has been gold standard. I don't think we've ever seen in this country, since the birth of democracy, a process where you had as many open, transparent interactions with the public over redistricting. You can go online today, you can go online in 5 years, and watch every minute of deliberation over a line they drew through a park with no people. I mean, it was all the minutia is there. So the process is gold standard. I think it'll be replicated nationally and locally. What Matt's hitting on with regard to kind of not meeting the expectations of Prop 20, Prop 11, I think he's right as well. But some of the campaigns for these ballot measures set irrational expectations for redistricting. The idea was that redistricting would create competitive elections where ideas mattered, where candidates would debate towards the middle, become more moderate, and that it would reduce the dysfunction in Sacramento. And I think that was a smart political campaign, but it wasn't a good setup for this process, because that's not what this process is able to do. The commission didn't have the tools to create competitive elections. they were really handcuffed by a lot of the law that the voters don't really understand the intricacies of the Voting Rights Act. And even things they expected they would be able to do, like have 67 hearings. They ended up having 34. They wanted to have 3 drafts. They ended up having 2. They wanted to do a lot more districts that were circles and squares and made sense visually, and they ended up having to create a ton of districts that look like the same serpentine things that we had in the old maps. There was, in the old map, what they called the Ribbon of Shame. It was a district that went up the coast and was Lois Capps' congressional district. They got rid of it. Now they have another Ribbon of Shame that goes from Rancho Palos Verdes all the way up the coast just below that and into West Hollywood. Henry Waxman's district will all go all the way down to the Port of LA.
So
or
what's
Rancho Cordova being connected with Death Valley. There's lots of examples.
And so, you know, the expectation the public had was set irrationally high because of the political campaigns, and so to hold the commission to those expectations is unfair. In the end, I think it's a much better process. There are people squawking about the transparency, but like compared to what? I mean, there's no legislative hearing that is this transparent. There is no, you know, if Anthony Portantino, who's railing against the legislature for not releasing budgets of Assembly and Senate offices, he could get the budgets of the members of the commission. He could see all their per diems. He could see the salary of everybody who works on that commission. So there's more transparency in this process than there is in the legislature, in our governor's office, anywhere else.
Helen, for the average voter, why does it matter?
I like the quote that says, you know, you should only care about redistricting if you care about money or power. Drawing the districts is the source of the political power. And so it matters. In the past, the legislators, the politicians have drawn districts to choose their voters. In this case, it was the public, the citizens, drawing the districts where they thought made sense to the communities.
Yeah, but even so, to go back to Paul's point, how is it that it's going to make a difference? There's an expectation among many people that somehow the outcomes are going to change. Is that an unrealistic expectation?
In the past, when communities were split, it disenfranchised people. And by trying to keep communities together as best as they can, and it was a series of trade-offs. I have no argument about that. So communities were still split. Then you have more sense of empowerment by allowing a community to have one vote together. And what the commission did was try to make trade-offs, and so that a community might be split in one of the districts, but then they would keep it whole in another.
Matt, one of the things in talking about communities of interest and the like, we've gone through this entire process, and whether it came out perfect or not, it is a process that most people would say is far more transparent and empowers people.
It'd be hard to argue that it's not.
It would be hard to argue that it's not. In terms of the participation and the buy-in from California, what did you notice as a participant in the process?
Well, I think that, a couple things. One is that the commission did a great job in terms of taking public testimony. They actually got on their horses and they traveled from Redding to San Diego and a lot of places in between. And, you know, while I'm critical of the process, it's hard to be critical of the commissioners. They put their lives on hold for this process. They worked very hard to try to do that. I think they misallocated their time, but they certainly allocated their overall time as individuals to this process, and they should be commended for that, without a doubt. In terms of the process, though, in terms of people being involved, it seemed to be, and I make the comparison to a newly elected city council, where their popularity is at an all-time high the day after their election they're elected, and it just starts going down as they start upsetting people. If Scott's sitting up there, he's got to choose between, you just got elected, you're at your height of popularity, but then at the very next meeting you got to choose between Paul and Helen. Your popularity starts going down because you've upset one of them. And what the commission would do is, and a great example is after the first draft of maps. The Latino community was harmed, I would argue harmed, by the first set of draft maps. Well, they had a lot of public testimony saying, well, this is wrong, this doesn't work. Well, the commission then overcorrected, in my mind, to be able to do that. And they overcorrected for anyone who was last at the podium. So the last person at the podium, let's try to make Paul happy, let's try to make Helen happy. And they would keep the city of Davis with Sacramento, then they would throw it out, they would put it back in, depending who the last person to talk to them was. And so everyone had the chance to participate, but you really wanted to be last. I mean, you wanted to be the last person up there to give them the credit.
That reminds me of a very interesting quote. Some observers have said that politics is too important to be left to a bunch of occasional lay people. Redistricting should be left to the professionals. What's your response, Helen, to that criticism?
I think that if you look at this process, you'll see that people, when they get engaged, actually come up with reasonable processes and reasonable results. And that the results that we got out aren't perfect. Nobody's going to claim that these maps are perfect.
Tell us a little bit about the level of engagement in this process.
So there were, I can't remember how many thousands of people that applied to be on the commission from there at the very beginning. And then when the commission went out on the road and was doing public hearings, there were thousands of people that came, and some of them drove for hours to be able to speak. And then, tens of thousands more emails that they got. So that, and mail and faxes and letters, some of which had pictures of things. And so people were really engaged, and I think it was a fact that they knew they were going to be heard.
Paul, do you have any example of how it is that those folks who drove, participated, got involved, did they change anything?
Yeah, it's interesting is one of the guys I met near the end of the process was this guy Glenn from Santa Cruz. He was really concerned that Santa Cruz had been split in the congressional district. And the city had sent in letters that said the city had gone to hearings, but it seemed as though nobody had figured out a solution. I worked with him on a solution that was like this 4-part solution. It affected 3 different congressional districts throughout Santa Clara. And in the end, the commission took our maps. We were, like Matt said, the last people to speak. We came up with exactly what lines we wanted.
And you were rewarded.
We were rewarded, and we got exactly what he wanted. Santa Cruz is whole, and I'm hoping they have a ticker tape parade for this guy Glenn, who sat on that commission Friday through Sunday with his UC Santa Cruz sweatshirt, and spoke every chance he got. But then what's interesting is I was on a hour-long interview with Connie Galambos Malloy, one of the commissioners on some radio program in San Francisco. And this caller comes in, and he's the mayor of a city in like East Menlo Park. And he says, on the last day, you guys split us. You split us, not only did you split us in the congressional district, but you split us away from the larger city of Menlo Park or whatever, somewhere up there. And Connie was like, well, I don't know why we split, and I can't speak to specific districts. And I'm sitting there just kind of like laughing to myself, because I know why he was split, because I split him. because we went up the last day, changed all these lines to bring Santa Cruz whole, but in the end we ended up splitting Gilroy, we ended up moving different communities, and we were the last people in there to be able to make that change. And so like Matt said, sometimes it was that last voice that would trump 6 or 7 times that other people had come forward with maps or ideas.
Well, but back to the process on that. The city of Menlo Park, in this example with this mayor, because there weren't drafts released by the commission, they got to the point where they were at the point of no return, which was when they voted on it. It was released the day before when they could finally see the maps. There was no ability for them to be able to correct that. That map was going to be voted on July 31st, and there was no turning back. Menlo Park wasn't monitoring the commission. There were 200 people in the state monitoring the commission. They lose because there was no draft map submitted by the commission, and that was totally predictable when they canceled the 2nd and 3rd release of draft maps.
Another unintended consequence. Matt, I want to ask you about an unintended consequence that's getting a little bit of airplay these days. And that is that many of the interest groups that were supportive of taking the redistricting process out of the hands of the politicians and putting it into this commission process were on the more conservative side of the ledger. But the unintended consequences appear to be that Republicans in this state are going to be disadvantaged as we move forward. You have any reaction to that?
Absolutely. What's really fascinating for me is that for my colleagues and friends in the Republican Party, they have this expectation that 20 members of Congress, or 19, is what they have some sort of right to. Well, the reality is they artificially were at 19 or 20 because the gerrymander that occurred 10 years ago. So this is really 20 years of California demographics taking hold all at once, because there was an artificial protection here a while ago with some districts that were just crazy. The Richard Pombo district that stretches from Stockton all the way down to, is it Gilroy or Morgan Hill? Morgan Hill.
And
so it goes
up.
It goes up in Alameda County. It's just kind of crazy. So they were buffeted from the real, true demographics of California. And for those people who are critical of Prop 11 and Prop 20, who are Republicans, I can draw maps that would eliminate 10 Republican members of Congress. I mean, there would be gerrymanders with that. But if Governor Brown, Speaker Perez, who is a brilliant political guy, and Senator Steinberg were to draw those internally where they're trying to put together maps based on the votes they can get to get a majority, it would be far worse for Republicans. So for those people who sit there and say, well, I don't like the process by the way the commission drew the maps and the way it impacts our political party, my response is, without Prop 11 and Prop 20, you would have been in a far worse situation. So those criticisms to me just fall on deaf ears. They got a much better system than they would have otherwise.
Well, I guess that's going to be another show, because we'd love to hear your advice on what the Republican Party in California should do next.
I hope that's a 4-hour show.
On a Sunday night at like 3 in the morning.
Probably won't be many viewers, but I got a lot to say.
There you go. I want to ask the question, when we look at the state process, and even though there have been some problems with it, there seems to be broad agreement among the three of you that there has been increased transparency and a better process than if the politicians had been left to their own designs. Currently here in the city of Sacramento, there's a brewing controversy about the redrawing of their districts locally. Any reaction from the lessons that you all have learned from the California process for the city of Sacramento?
Well, first off, I want to put out there that I have had some clients in the city of Sacramento. I've worked with the Downtown Partnership on a project to keep the downtown whole within the city redistricting. And I've also been informally helping the LGBT community in Sacramento and statewide in trying to keep the gay community together in Midtown. But with that being said, Sacramento has a process that's a commission. And some people had said at the outset that this was just window dressing. I had hoped that the commission product, which would be a few maps for alternatives for the council to adopt, that they would have gone into their city council meeting and adopted one of those 3 or 4 options. And they had some issue with the rail yards. There was an issue about wanting to put the rail yards into the district going north rather than downtown. That's like, in the census, it has like 12 people associated with the rail yards. So there's really nobody there. They could have done that and passed this thing out. But instead, they did this big grandstanding thing. Now everybody's paying attention to what the council's doing, that they are in fact drawing their own lines. There are 2 council members who've come forward with their own proposals, and I feel they've made a mockery of this Citizens Commission process. And I believe that there will be activists out there, and I've actually talked with Matt about this, who are going to be looking at potentially creating a binding commission for redistricting in Sacramento. I think what the council has done has been a real detriment to this new changing and evolution of redistricting to get out of back rooms and into the public.
You know what's crazy about this, and this is kind of my putting on my local elected official hat. What's crazy about this is there seems to be some misunderstanding of elected officials in California that a geographic feature has to be in your district to have any sort of voting control over it or submitting a proposal that actually is binding on it. Now, certainly there is some deference among elected officials within districts to say, well, this is in your district, I want to do that. For something like the rail yards, it's 12 people. It doesn't matter. If any member of the Sacramento City Council wants to get engaged in that process or submit a proposal about it, they're free to do that. It's within their jurisdiction, they can do that. I had a colleague recently tell me that he wanted to have a certain city in his district because he likes having lunch there. Well, that's fabulous, but nothing prevents you from having lunch anywhere you want. It doesn't have to be in your district to be able to order a sandwich there. Yeah. And I've never understood this whole thing where people fight over geographic features that really just don't matter in the big scheme of things.
You know, one of the funniest ones was during the debate over one of the African American districts. Somebody actually got up and criticized the commission because the airport terminals were in one congressional district, and my God, baggage claim was in another. Why? How are you going to get your bags if there's someone else's congressional district?
Well, actually, it was viewed as an insensitive comment by some, but one of the commissioners said, well, we're talking about splitting another community, but we got 4 airport people here. You know, if we're talking about splitting a neighborhood versus airport people, I'm inclined to go with the neighborhood and go ahead and split the airport people. And some people thought that was outrageous that they would say that. But, you know, it's 4 people who are randomly counted on census day who happen to be sleeping at the airport. They're probably not going to be there by the time the next election occurs.
Helen, let's talk a little bit about the issue of the impact on minority communities and the Voting Rights Act as a consideration. Paul just mentioned the fact that in consideration of some of the African American interests, that they were players in this process as well. Yes. How are the emerging demographics of California, how are they impacting this process, and how is that going to manifest itself in the future?
So the Voters First Act, Prop 11, laid out a set of criteria which the Commission has to follow, and the first criteria is equal population, but the second criteria, so really right in their top, is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. So all of the various communities were there at the table when this was written, when the Voting Rights, or when the Voters First Act was written, Prop 11, and they continued to monitor and they continued to speak.
So,
I'd like to address the African American issue,
you wanna
if
do
you
that
don't mind,
one?
because it's very important in this process, and it's a big part of the history when we think about the commission looking back on it. The Latino community, a different standard was applied by the commission to the Latino community versus Latino and Asian community in California. We have 30 total in terms of all the plans, Assembly, Senate, and Congress added up, 30 majority-minority districts in California under these new plans, 29 Latino and 1 Asian. For the African American community, although I think everyone would admit you can draw a relatively compact district that's just as good as the commissions and some of their strange shapes, you can draw a very similar district in South Central Los Angeles for the African American community among citizens voting age population. And what happened in the process is that because we have 3 African American members of Congress, Congresswoman Bass, Maxine Waters, and Laura Richardson, they actually became a big part of the debate during the final days of the commission. And basically they said, don't draw one district, because then there would only be one of us that would end up with a majority African American district. We need to break up that community and put it in 3 different districts so that we'll all have some base of African American voters. And even though they didn't mention those members of Congress by name, clearly they were involved in the process. And the commission, and I'm critical of their read of the Voting Rights Act, took political expediency into account, and that's what they voted for. They voted for a politically expedient alternative that I think kind of eviscerates the Voting Rights Act.
and who did it hurt?
Well, you know something? Actually, in terms of who it hurts the integrity of the Voting Rights Act. An African-American commissioner from Los Angeles, I don't remember what his quote was exactly, Paul. It was Parvenu. What was his quote exactly?
Commissioner Parvenu, who's African-American and one of the commissioners, was looking at downtown LA, and he was actually like a city planner for a city of LA, so he understands this area. And he said that in this case, that the Voting Rights Act was being used as a weapon against the African-American community.
Really?
And we believe that is going to be, the students in law school are going to be studying that quote
That's
for
the
years.
quote of the year.
Yeah, absolutely the quote of the year.
How so, though?
The reason is that African Americans in LA, based on this great compromise 10 years ago and probably even 20 years ago, they realized that in a 30% African American district, African Americans can safely get elected because Latinos turn out in such small numbers, and
Or they're not
especially
citizens.
or they're not citizens, and then traditionally you could, in a Democratic primary, the African American could win the primary, then be the Democratic choice in the general. So through a combination of their vote propensity and kind of this vote rolling, African Americans could be safe, and there were 3 safe African American districts, none of them 50% African American. The highest was around 40. So they figured 30–40% African American, we're good. So instead of the commission doing what Matt said they needed to do, which is draw one big 51% African American seat and 2 12% African American seats, they created 3 that were 28, 34, and 40% African American.
And I would argue, if you would take that same standard and applied it in the southern portion of the United States, that's what the Voting Rights Act was put into place to prevent, which is to break up the African American community so they couldn't elect anyone. It's really interesting how it's come full circle in California, saying, well, what is arguably, actually maybe inarguably, the most important civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress, the Voting Rights Act, is now doing a disservice to the very people it was meant to protect.
But Helen, to follow that point a bit further,
Okay.
in order to advantage one group, it disadvantages another. Who, other than the process itself, as Matt referenced, who gets harmed?
Any other community that would be split by what happens.
So is that the Latino community? Is it the Asian community?
I actually don't know those maps the way these gentlemen do. So,
It could be
so I
Latino.
don't-
It could also be some white voters, and throughout the state, suburban white voters were getting lumped into Latino districts, and there was all this math going on trying to get the right percentage Latino in districts. And what ended up happening was when they created these 3 African American seats, they had to do something with the remainder, and that's where you got the Henry Waxman seat that goes all the way from Palos Verdes, goes up the coast. At Dockweiler State Park, it goes down to like just the road, just the no people, just State Park and road.
You realize how ridiculous that's.
Yeah, it's like high tide, the district disappears, and then it comes back into Santa
And it's
Monica.
non-contiguous. We've got a lawsuit.
It comes back into Santa Monica and it goes into West Hollywood. So now the West Hollywood voters are paired all the way around with the Republican Asian Palos Verdes voters in a district that, to get from one side to the other, you'd have to leave the district, drive through downtown LA, and then get back to the other side of the district. So the process can suffer. These communities might have gotten a worse off district because of that need to create the 3 African American seats. I personally spoke in favor of the 3 African American seats because being an Angelino, I understand the need to be able to have African American representation in an area where it's dwindling, but I also understand that it came at some costs to others in those communities.
All right.
But would you agree it's an inconsistent application of the Voting Rights Act for the Latino community versus the African American community?
All right, at that point, we're going to have to figure out how to agree to disagree. I want to go in our closing moments. I want to ask you all a really important question. I think that for the voters of California and the citizens, what is it that this process tells us about our state? And I'd like each one of you to take a moment and answer that question. You have 15 seconds.
Okay. Well, it tells me that regular Californians can come together and work with their own different viewpoints of the state and come up with a better solution than what the state would have created. It's a great process, a gold standard process, and I think that everybody who's been involved in it needs a nice pat on the back.
Matt?
I think it shows that California takes about 7 months to understand. I mean, the commission had to work really hard to be able to get there, and I'm not sure that they actually got there to the understanding that people who really study it and put their time in would do it. But California is very complicated. It took them dozens of meetings to be able to do it, and 7 or 8 months.
Helen?
I would say that when Californians are given a chance to be heard as part of the process, we come out in droves. And so civic engagement is possible in California.
Thank you all. That's our show for today. I'd like to thank our guests, Paul Mitchell, Helen Hutchison, and Matt Rexrode. There's lots of talk on television, but only a few places where you can be a part of the conversations that matter. I'm Scott Syfax, and you've been watching Studio Sacramento. Join us next time right here on KVIE.
I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of 5 Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.